going to talk about some of the musical and technical decisions I made when preparing a video performance of Bach's Prelude and Fugue in G major, BWV 860. Of course, there are many ways to play this piece, but I'm just going to talk about the way I play it and why. The G major Prelude is one of the many arpeggio study preludes in the Well-Tempered Clavier. It is more jubilant than the famous C major Prelude, but I don't think a manically fast speed is effective because there are too many interesting things going on. Both the G major and C major preludes rely heavily on the use of pedal points. By pedal point, I mean a note held or repeated over more than one measure, usually in the bass. For example, the bass G is repeated 15 times during the first 2.5 measures. What is interesting about pedal points is that they are separate from the actual harmonic progression of the music going on above or below them. They may be consonant with a harmony or they may be dissonant, but they emphasize the overall tonal structure of a piece. In measure 2, the upper voice strays into the territory of this pedal point G. I was tempted to let my left hand pick up a few notes from the right hand, but I found that if I kept all or most of the moving notes in the right hand, I could more effectively maintain and express the flow of energy in this uninterrupted group of arpeggios over the pedal point. It looks awkward to have the hands on top of each other, but it is a useful technique which comes up from time to time in 18th century music. In measures 4 and 5, we see that Bach has created a pedal point in a middle voice called an inverted pedal point. That is a way for him to maintain triplet or sextuplet movement, while the melodic line in both the treble and bass is by step and not by arpeggio. In measures 6 and 8, we have diminished seventh harmonies, which are a real shift in color from the major harmonies we have heard so far in the piece. In measures 11 and 12, we have a pedal point D in the bass, and suddenly the harmonies become much richer. It is not just that the harmonies are changing above the pedal point, and that the harmonies are now changing every half measure instead of every measure, but for the first time in the piece, Bach is using suspensions as dissonances on the strong beats. He has even written in a slur on the first one to show that the dissonant A must be slurred to its resolution, G. Here's a way of looking at the true harmonic progression without the pedal point to distract us. It is such a beautiful moment, unlike the carefree exuberance of the opening of the piece, and I like to highlight it by making a wetter sound using overholding. In measures 16 and 17, I had to experiment with different fingerings in the left hand. In the middle of the second beat of 16, there's a rapid repetition of B natural. It is always good practice on the harpsichord to play repeated notes with different fingers. So I'm using my second and fourth fingers here. Then there's a sequence of a downward triad followed by a higher eighth note. At first, I followed the principle of using a single hand position for a group of notes. So I played the triad 2, 3, 5, followed by the thumb. But at this fast tempo, I found that using 1, 2, 4, 1 was more secure, even though it meant that the thumb had to keep moving right to play the eighth note. The movement of the thumb after the eighth note helps you to accent that note by shortening it. As Gustav Leonhardt would say, short accented notes can be witty. I made an exception for the F sharp in the middle of measure 17, which I play with the second finger. Sometimes it really is best to keep the thumb away from the raised keys. Whenever you use your thumb, and especially in passages like this, it is best to bend the first knuckle so that the first joint is parallel with the key, just as the other four fingers are normally parallel with the key, and pull back on the thumb rather than move it up and down. That gives you much more control over the thumb's movement. In any case, fingerings are really personal. These ones work for me, but they may not be best for you. The confident, positive mood of the prelude continues in the fugue. What makes the fugue subject really interesting is the two leaps of a seventh in the second and third measures and the syncopation they create. It makes a lot of sense to articulate those leaps strongly. After the first few measures, Bach is once again utilizing perpetual motion as a way to drive forward all the way to the 86th measure. This is truly a keyboard fugue in the sense that one cannot imagine it played by a group of instruments, and all the motifs fit very nicely within the hand. Although the fugue is in three voices, Bach loves to turn a single voice into effectively two voices, as we see in the bass from measures 16 to 19. That creates a very full sound on the harpsichord. Whenever you look at Bach fugues, you can see that he has taken a lot of trouble to make them playable by two hands, or on the organ, playable by two hands and 2 feet. Or shall we say, just about playable, as there are sometimes some very awkward passages, particularly when in one hand you have to hold a long note and play a moving voice at the same time. There are lots of places where one finger has to jump from key to key, and even the thumb does this. In measures 64 and 69-70, there are long trills. It can be very effective to end a long trill right on the following strong beat. The last statement of the fugue theme starts in measure 79, and the piece could have ended in the cadence to 83. Instead, we get 4 measures over a pedal point G. The G is tied for 2.5 measures, longer than it can be heard on the harpsichord. I don't think this is an indication that the piece is for organ, although it could conceivably be played on the organ, as G major is not a problematic key in terms of orning tunings of the time. In the Well-Tempered Clavier, we often see bass notes tied over several measures in pieces which seem totally idiomatic for the harpsichord. Did Bach expect us to continue the sound in our mind's ear, or would he sometimes have restruck the key? We shall never know, and I think that's very much up to the player. In the very last measure, Bach shows us how the fugue's perpetual motion needs to unwind by carefully notating overholdings which form a relaxed arpeggio. As there is a long pedal point and an unwinding arpeggio at the end, I use very little ritardando, as I want the piece to end with almost as much energy as it begins. You can hear my performance of this piece by clicking on the link. The video has a scrolling score with my fingerings if you're interested. Thanks for listening.